Hey everybody, Mark Dawes here. Now in this video I want to give you 10 good reasons why you should not consider training with us and why you should not consider us as your training provider. Yeah, that's right, I'm giving you reasons why you shouldn't choose us. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little story, and it's around a phrase that's called nailing your colours to the mast. And then I want to talk about Olusegun Lewis. Now in the age of sail, ships would legally fight, going into battle whilst displaying their nation's flag. Now, if they ever lowered that flag, which was termed as striking the colours, that was a universally recognised indication of surrender, particularly for ships at sea in the days of sail. So, for a ship to surrender, they would lower their flag. But another time this would happen, or there would be a misindication of this, is if the flag was hit by cannon fire from another ship and the flag got damaged and therefore started to drop. Now, when this happened, the other side, the enemy, if you like, would actually stop firing because they wouldn't know for definite whether the ship was surrendering or not. So they would wait for the other ship to confirm whether or not they were surrendering or not. And if not, then the battle would commence, which is a pretty, gentlemanly thing to do, I suppose. But to prevent this happening at sea, what happened as a result of this was that sailors would nail their ship's colours, their Union flag, to the masts. So they would nail the colours to the mast. And that way, even if the flag was hit, unless of course the mast collapsed, the flag would not dip, and therefore this became a defiant signal of not surrendering and fighting to the end. Now, let's talk about Olusegun Lewis. Now, this young man died as a result of being restrained at a hospital in London. He went in for an overnight stay as a voluntary patient, but when he tried to leave, a doctor called police to ask for assistance in detaining him under the Mental Health Act. Now, the reasons the doctor felt the need to call for police assistance was because they felt that the staff of the hospital did not have the necessary restraint skills or the training to enable them to safely restrain Mr. Lewis. So the police responded and they used their training to restrain Mr. Lewis, and into the inquest's death into Mr. Lewis, the coroner found that the force used on him was excessive, disproportionate, and that it was that ultimately led to his death. The inquest jury also unanimously condemned the healthcare staff actions in relation to the death of 23-year-old Mr. Lewis, and in their highly critical narrative they made a number of damning criticisms, one of which was this. They said multiple failures at multiple levels within Bethlehem Royal Hospital meant that the hospital staff had to call upon the assistance of the police when Shenny became unwell. Even Lewis's parents, who recently made a statement outside court via their solicitor, said this. They said, "We had taken Shenny to hospital because we thought it was the best place for him when he became ill." And the statement went on to say, "But instead of receiving the help and care he needed, he met with incompetence, hostility, and worse, from the management and staff of the hospital, who were so poorly trained that they felt it necessary to call the police to deal with him when he was agitated, and even more so from the police officers who answered that call." So just to summarise for a bit here, so far, poorly trained NHS staff felt the need to call for police assistance because they didn't have the necessary skills to safely restrain Mr. Lewis, and it was the police officers' use of force that actually killed him. As a result of all of what I've just mentioned, a new law was proposed which came into effect in November 2018 called the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act. Now, part of the new act states that mental health unit staff must be provided with training on appropriate use of force, and that would seem to make sense actually, considering that it was a lack of appropriate training on the use of force that led to the NHS staff having to call for police assistance. But for clarification here, the legal definition of the word must in an Act of Parliament means that it's mandatory. So must be provided with training on appropriate use of force. That's a mandatory statute requirement. This must means that any use of force training must be appropriate enough to control the risks that are likely to be presented. So under the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act 2018, the training, just to clarify once more, must be appropriate, which to me means that it must be fit for the purpose for which it is intended. In other words, it must work. Then on the back of all this, we got a new non-statutory PI accreditation scheme, which has been devised, and it's due to come into effect from April next year, April 2020. Now, the aim of the scheme should be consistent with what the new Act of Parliament requires, which is to ensure that mental health unit staff must be provided with training on the appropriate use of force. And if it's to be of any practical benefit, it should be primarily aimed at keeping vulnerable patients and staff safe. And more importantly, the techniques and skills provided must work. They must reduce the risk. But let's take a serious look at this for a moment. This new PI accreditation is based on an ISO IEC 17065 standard for certification bodies. Now, I spoke to UCAS about this, and in one of the emails I received back from them, UCAS stated the following. They said, the RRN standard is focused on providing training in mechanisms and processes to reduce the need to use physical intervention. The standard requires the training provider, in conjunction with the service, to identify and justify which restraint techniques it will use. The standard then has requirements on how this training is delivered. As a result, the assessment of the training provider does assess the applicability and suitability of the training in physical interventions, and there is a requirement for the assessors to observe this in practice. However, what the scheme fails to do is consider the individual techniques that make up the training. So, provided that the training complies with the standards, with the odd exception, i.e. to discourage any techniques that use pain or prone, etc., the specific techniques are not examined too closely. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that someone passing the accreditation could look good on paper, but could actually be teaching or using physical restraint techniques that are in fact quite dangerous, which could lead to someone being seriously injured or killed. And that seems to fly in the face of what this new legislation states with regards to must be appropriate. In addition, according to our initial research, an organisation would fail the accreditation process if they admit to teaching or using any technique that may cause pain, intentionally or unintentionally, or any form of prone stroke face down technique, but after much opposition, apparently, they will now allegedly consider these skills provided that they are classified and used as escape and rescue purposes. So they're classified and used for emergency escape and rescue purposes only. Now, another hurdle here is that NHS England have now made it a condition of contract that anyone providing training in the NHS in England under a standard condition of contract must hold a new PI accreditation from April next year. So how does an organisation then, or a training provider, deal with this situation? How do they attain accreditation to allow them to continue or to start delivering training in an NHS hospital in England if the system they teach provides instruction in techniques that may cause pain, intentionally or unintentionally, or any other form of prone or face down technique? Even if in some cases, based on individual patients' behavioural care plans and restraint risk assessments, those techniques are needed to reduce the risk to the patient and to staff, which makes them legally appropriate by default. Well, it seems the answer lies in three basic options, from what we can gather anyway. One is simply remove the offending techniques from the system and syllabus altogether, so take them out. Two, keep the techniques in, but tell or encourage staff not to report the use of the offending techniques. Or three, change the names of the offending techniques so that they are intentionally not recorded accurately. But surely this is illegal, right? Or at best, if it is allegedly happening, dishonest or possibly even fraudulent. And what is going to be the likely effect of all this on an already stressed NHS staff? Well, it's going to demotivate them and it's going to de-skill them. It would discourage staff to use physical intervention to protect their patients or their colleagues for fear of being disciplined, ostracised, or possibly even worse. In some cases, if staff were bullied, and I'm not going to dress this up because that is what is apparently, allegedly, I have to use the word allegedly, happening already. What if they're bullied into either not reporting or being made to change their reported statement of events? It will take away their confidence to use a system of intervention that is inherently flawed. Now, another allegation being made is that pain compliance techniques and prone restraints no longer appear as recording options on use of force forms, meaning that they will no longer be recorded. And how is that, legislatively appropriate? Now, interestingly, one of the opportunities to improve practice that has been stated on a Restraint Reduction Network slide is, and I quote, reduce prevalence of trauma caused by restraint, unquote. Yeah, what I've just described to you is very likely to expose NHS staff to the risk of PTSD. Now, how can I say that? Well, the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which is the Bible of psychiatry and psychology, has highlighted the fact that any time the causal factor of a stressor is human in nature, the degree of trauma is usually more severe and long-lasting. They go on to say this, which is really interesting. The manual states that although post-traumatic stress disorder is comparably rare and mild in response to natural disasters and traffic accidents, when it is another human being that causes our fear, pain and suffering, it shatters, destroys and devastates us. In short, human aggression towards another human being can lead to PTSD, especially if the recipient of that has not had the appropriate training to effectively deal with it, or worse still, is made to feel they are part of the problem. So let's just recap. 1. Mr. Lewis died because he was restrained by 11 police officers. That's what killed him. The police were called because the NHS staff were so poorly trained, according to the inquest and to the statements made by Mr. Lewis's family, that they felt it necessary to call the police to deal with him. As a result of that, the Mental Health Unit's Use of Force Act 2018 came into effect. One aim of the new act is to ensure that mental health unit staff must be provided with training on appropriate use of force. And on the back of that, this new PI accreditation is now due to come into effect from April 2020 for NHS in England, which NHS England have now made a condition of contract. The new PI accreditation, however, does not deal with the specific physical techniques per se, so an organisation can pass the certification process but can still be teaching techniques that may either not work or could be dangerous. The higher level and more restrictive techniques, prone and pain compliance, have to either be removed, not reported or disingenuously reported, allegedly, for an organisation to achieve certification. This means that a system of PI in an NHS hospital in England may be accredited on paper, but is flawed if it doesn't meet the requirements of a risk assessment in terms of what should actually be provided. Net result? Staff feel even more de-skilled and more demotivated, as well as possibly scared, frustrated and stressed at using something they feel may not work, particularly if they don't feel supported. This will very likely lead to either a real or perceived lack of capability to use the skills they are taught, so the trust will probably end up having to call the police, who are exempt from the new PI accreditation, and will probably end up using the very techniques that the NHS staff are discouraged from using. The fact is this: Mr. Lewis died following restraint by police officers, not NHS staff, and this new accreditation will not prevent another death due to restraint. In fact, I actually think it will increase the risk. That's my own personal opinion. It also seems that this new PI accreditation has taken us back to the dark ages of restraint, to a time when staff were too scared to report. Yet this has been done in an age where, post Winterbourne View and other abuse scandals, the need to be transparent is always waved round like some rallying call. I genuinely feel for the parents of Mr. Lewis. No one should lose a son. But the focus of this new PI accreditation scheme is way off mark. So let's get back to the point of this video, what I started with. If you are looking for a training provider to provide training to your staff who is certified under this new scheme, please don't come to us. We can't help you, because we have no intention of signing up for something that I believe is inherently flawed. However, if you genuinely care about the people you serve and your staff, and if you're looking to work with a training provider who will deliver a legally defensible system of physical intervention for you, one that has been properly risk assessed and medically reviewed, and a training provider who will guarantee to stand by you and your staff when required, then you're the type of organisation that we want to work with. If not, then please go and choose another training provider, because we are definitely not the right fit for you. Now, whatever you decide to do, I wish you well. This is going to be an interesting time, that's the way I'll put it. And I understand the pressures that many of you are under, but please bear in mind that this is not for us. So if you are looking for someone to be certificated under this new scheme, please don't come to us. Now, that's my colours nailed to the mast. I wish you well in whatever you do. If you need any help or advice, please get in touch. More than happy to help and assist where required. But I just wanted to make my position clear on this. Now, having said all that, go and have a great day. Speak to you all soon. And by the way, people always ask, No need to ask. If this is of any help to anyone, please feel free to share it on whatever page or whoever you wish. Okay, thanks ever so much. Hopefully, speak to some of you soon. You take care now. Have a great day.